After more than 31 hours lost in the Atlantic, Bismarck had been found again, but time favored her. At her speed, she was less than a day from U-boat and Luftwaffe protection. Admiral John Tovey's battleships were simply too far away. King George V lay 135 miles to the north, Rodney 125 miles to the northeast and slower. Unless Bismarck could be crippled, neither would catch her. That left one force with a chance, Force H, steaming north from Gibraltar under Vice Admiral James Somerville. The battlecruiser Renown was closest, but with Hood barely 2 days lost, the Admiralty forbade a solo engagement. Everything now depended on Ark Royal. At 8:35, Ark Royal had already sent ferry Swordfish searching. When the Catalina's sighting arrived, the two nearest Swordfish turned at once. At 11:14, aircraft 2H sighted Bismarck. 7 minutes later, 2F confirmed the contact. More Swordfish with long-range tanks were launched to relieve them and hold the trail. The net was tightening, and the next strike would decide everything. At 14:50, 15 ferry Swordfish lifted off from Ark Royal, led by Lieutenant Commander J.A. Stuart Moore. An hour later, radar contact was made, and the biplanes plunged to attack, only to discover too late that the target was not Bismarck, but the British cruiser Sheffield sent ahead to shadow her. 11 torpedoes were dropped, none struck home. Faulty magnetic detonators saved Sheffield. Some torpedoes exploded harmlessly, others missed outright. The Swordfish battled brutal weather on the return, landing after 1,700 hours on a violently pitching deck. 3 aircraft wrecked their undercarriages as the stern rose and fell by more than 50 feet. The chance was squandered, but the hunt was not over. At 17:40, Sheffield finally sighted Bismarck herself. There would be no more mistakes. Night was closing in, and this was the last real chance to stop the battleship before she reached France. At 19:15, Ark Royal launched a second strike, 15 Swordfish again, many of the same battered aircraft, but this time armed with contact detonators and torpedoes set to run shallow. It was the final throw of the dice. As the British closed in, fate played a cruel irony. The German submarine U-556, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Herbert Wolfarth, sighted Renown and Ark Royal at 19:48, coming out of the mist at high speed, not zigzagging and perfectly positioned for a kill. But U-556 was out of torpedoes. Her last fish spent days earlier. All Wolfarth could do was signal the enemy's course and speed as he witnessed activity on Ark Royal's flight deck, which transpired to be the launching of the second fatal attack on Bismarck. To make things even more heartbreaking for Captain Lieutenant Wolfarth, U-556 and Bismarck had been built side by side on the slips at Blohm and Voss, with both vessels completed around the same period. When U-556's commissioning drew near, Wolfarth hoped to have a band for the ceremony but lacked the funds to hire one. Captain Ernst Lindemann, Bismarck's commanding officer, offered the use of his ship's band instead. In gratitude, Wolfarth created a tongue-in-cheek Patenschaftsurkunde, or Certificate of Sponsorship, pledging that U-556 would safeguard Bismarck. One illustration depicts Wolfarth as the Knight Parzival atop U-556, felling aircraft with a sword while simultaneously reaching beneath the waves to halt a torpedo with his thumb. A second illustration portrays the submarine towing the battleship out of danger. I doubt that, in their wildest dreams, either man could have guessed how accurate that drawing would soon become. But unfortunately for the Bismarck and her crew, the drawing remained just that, as the U-556 submerged to avoid being detected. Minutes later, Ark Royal's Swordfish, now led by Lieutenant Commander T.P. Coode, closed in. Using Sheffield to fix the range, they began their attack at 20:47. Bismarck's guns erupted, flinging fire into the dark. At least 2 torpedoes struck home, one amidships on the port side, causing little damage, another smashed into the stern on the starboard quarter. That hit was decisive. Both rudders jammed hard over, locking the battleship into an uncontrollable turn. Bismarck swung in a wide circle, then began to stagger northwest into the wind, helpless. As before, none of the Swordfish were lost, though several limped back riddled with holes. The damage was catastrophic. At 21:40, Admiral Lütjens signaled Group West. "Ship unable to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The torpedo strike in the stern flooded the steering gear and nearby compartments, sealing Bismarck's fate. Any repair now had to be done underwater. Divers were ordered into the steering compartment, but the violent rush of water made the space untouchable. Heavy seas ruled out lowering men over the side. One last desperate idea was raised: blow the jammed rudders clear and try to steer by propellers alone, but it was abandoned for fear the blast would cripple the screws as well. Deep inside the ship, in the turbine rooms, the reality set in. Bismarck was no longer a ship under command, but a giant driven by the sea itself, her course fixed and her end approaching. Kapitän Lieutenant Gerhard Junak down in the center turbine room described the event. One torpedo which hit amidships caused no damage, but the second affected the rudders disastrously, jamming the portside rudder at a 15-degree angle. Immediately, the Bismarck became no longer maneuverable. The torpedo hit on the rudder shook the ship so badly that even in my zone of action in the turbine room, the deck plates were thrown into the air and the hull vibrated violently. Shortly after the blow, water flooded through the port side gangways into the turbine room, and clouds of gas and smoke filled the room until the forced ventilation cleared it. The stern compartments of the ship were now flooding, but the men who had been stationed there could still be saved, and soon the carpenters and repair crew came through, making their way aft. But the ship pitched so violently in the strong sea swell that it was impossible to keep a foothold in the turbulent water surging through the companionway. All possibilities were now being considered to restore the ship's maneuverability, even if only temporarily. The commander, Kapitän zur See Lindemann, considered reports from Chief Engineer Lehmann, who was in continual contact with the repair and rescue teams. There was much gesticulation, and at one point the chief engineer stepped out of the circle, walked away, turned about, and made a sign of complete refusal. What this was about I'm not certain, but eventually it was found possible to connect the hand rudder. But the old rudder would not budge, and to attempt to cut it away with underwater saws was quite impossible because of the heavy swell. A proposal to force the rudder out from below with the help of explosives was rejected because of the proximity to the propellers. Thus, all experiments with the auxiliary rudder were given up as completely hopeless, with the old one immovable. The torpedo damage sent Bismarck slewing unpredictably and straight toward Sheffield. Around 21:45, Bismarck opened fire at roughly 9 miles, loosing 6 salvos. Sheffield turned away behind smoke, escaping without a hit, though splinters wrecked her radar and wounded a dozen men, 3 fatally. Contact was lost, but at 2200, Sheffield passed bearing and range to Captain Philip Wien's 4th destroyer flotilla. At 22:38, the Polish destroyer Pierun, commanded by Eugeniusz Plowski, sighted the German battleship. Bismarck replied with heavy fire, and the destroyers pressed in. Star shells lit the Black Sea after midnight. Bismarck refused to use searchlights, fighting blind to deny an aiming point. A star shell ignited a small fire on her bow, quickly beaten down. All night, in heavy seas and squalls, the destroyers attacked. All night, Bismarck beat them back with disciplined, accurate gunfire. By 0700, 16 torpedoes had been expended without a hit. At 07:22, the sun rose, revealing a battered unmaneuverability giant still afloat and the endgame about to begin. At 08:47, the execution began. Rodney fired first, followed a minute later by King George V at a range of roughly 20,000 meters. Bismarck answered at 08:49, but only with her two forward turrets Anton and Bruno trained on Rodney, her after turrets could not bear. The imbalance was stark. 4 German guns against 15 British, with Rodney's 9 all forward and King George V adding 6 more. The weight of fire only grew. At 08:54, HMS Norfolk joined in with her 8-inch guns, and by 08:58, Rodney's secondary battery was hammering as well. Bismarck was being smothered, yet even then, amid the storm of steel, she found her mark. In a brief, defiant moment, the German battleship straddled Rodney, a reminder that, though outgunned, she was not yet silenced. By 09:02, the end was accelerating. Bismarck was smashed repeatedly. Hits tore through the forecastle and foremast, destroying the foretop rangefinder. 2 minutes later, Dorsetshire joined the firing line. Now 4 heavy ships, Rodney, King George V, Norfolk, and Dorsetshire, were concentrating on a single target. At 09:08, Bismarck's forward fire control and turrets Anton and Bruno were knocked out. Control shifted aft, where Kapitän Lieutenant Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg briefly found the range, only to have his station obliterated by a 14-inch shell minutes later. The after turrets fought on under local control. Rodney even loosed torpedoes at close range, missing in the chaos. At 09:21, turret door was silenced by a catastrophic internal explosion. One forward turret fired a final defiant salvo at 09:27. Caesar answered 4 minutes later. Then only scattered secondary guns remained. Quickly crushed beneath the avalanche of British fire, Captain Ernst Lindemann gave the order to scuttle and abandon ship. With Bismarck helpless, Rodney closed to point-blank range, 2,500 to 4,000 meters, and hammered both flanks with her 16-inch guns. Hits landed shell by shell. Flames burst from Bruno's rear wall. Torpedoes followed, one likely striking home. Even then, the battered battleship refused to sink. Norfolk added torpedoes, men began leaping into the sea. All guns were silent, barrels frozen at odd angles. The superstructure was shredded, decks torn apart, and still, improbably, the mainmast stood, the battle flag snapping in the wind. At 10:16, Rodney ceased fire. Low on fuel, Admiral John Tovey turned away. Behind him lay a floating wreck, finished as a fighting ship, but not yet gone. At 09:20, Ark Royal launched 12 Fairey Swordfish for a final strike. They arrived over the battlefield around 10:15 but held off, hemmed in by the thunder of British guns. For a moment, King George V even mistook them for enemy aircraft and opened fire, fortunately, without effect. At 10:20, Dorsetshire closed in and fired 2 21-inch torpedoes from 3,000 meters into Bismarck's starboard side. Both struck, but the wrecked hull barely seemed to notice. Turning back, Dorsetshire fired again at 10:36 from 2,200 meters. This torpedo hit the port side. Overhead, the Swordfish circled, witnesses to the end. By then, Bismarck was heeling heavily to port, water washing the upper deck, secondary turrets nearly submerged. At 10:39, she rolled over and slipped beneath the Atlantic. The guns fell silent. The hunt was over. For nearly 2 hours after the guns first spoke, Bismarck stayed afloat. British fire began to land decisively at 09:02 and did not cease until about 10:16. 74 minutes of uninterrupted punishment at ranges that shrank to point blank. Few warships in history could have endured it. The contrast was stark. HMS Hood had been destroyed in 6 minutes only 3 days earlier, yet Bismarck's core defenses largely held. Neither the main belt nor the armored deck appears to have been decisively penetrated, and in the end it was her own crew who ensured she would not be captured. During that final action, 2,876 shells were hurled at her. 380 16-inch from Rodney, 339 14-inch from King George V, 527 8-inch from Norfolk, 254 8-inch from Dorsetshire, 716 6-inch from Rodney, 665.25-inch from King George V. It appears that the sustained rain of fire on the Bismarck had many different effects. When interrogated in Dorsetshire, Captain Lieutenant von Millenheim-Reckberg volunteered the information that at one time he was in C turret, which was ordered to engage Dorsetshire, but only fired 1 salvo at the ship. By this time, the personnel in the turret were becoming demoralized and began vacating the turret, remarking, "Why should we stay here for target practice?" He also left the turret. Captain Lieutenant von Millenheim-Reckberg has not again referred to this story, and it may be taken for granted that he was dazed and considerably shaken at the time of this interrogation. Similar scenes do, however, appear to have taken place in many parts of the ship, for at this time Bismarck was taking severe punishment. According to one prisoner, one officer drew his revolver and shot down some of the crew when they refused to obey him. Another prisoner refers to officers committing suicide. Still another prisoner mentioned that members of the crew lost their nerve and jumped overboard long before action ceased. It is known that almost the entire 400 men of the flak became casualties. No special protection had been arranged for these men during surface action, they merely being ordered to shelter behind the superstructure on the disengaged side, and huddling together for protection, groups of 40 or more men were wiped out at a time. With the ship listing to port and rolling and seas coming inboard, there were washed over the side scores of bodies, both the killed and of the wounded, whose grasp had weakened on whatever object they had been able to clutch. Hit after hit was now being registered on the upper deck, which was speedily reduced to a mass of twisted steel. Boats and lockers had been smashed to pieces. Machinery and instruments twisted and broken. Ready-use ammunition was exploding. A direct hit on the mainmast caused it, as one prisoner described, to spin round like a whirligig and come crashing down over the ship, creating fresh carnage. It hung down like a tangle of vines. Fires had broken out amidships and aft. The forward damage control center had been wrecked by a direct hit. Sheets of flame were issuing from the funnel. The ship's aircraft were also burning, a direct hit having struck a hangar, where a large number of men sheltering there had been killed. Smoke was pouring from holes 2 yards wide, which had been torn in the upper deck by shells which had penetrated below. Shells, according to prisoners, penetrated through the upper deck and the battery deck to the main deck. The majority of prisoners deny that the armored deck itself was pierced. Only one man, an officer, has made a statement to the contrary. He alleges this deck was penetrated in the vicinity of the WT room and suggests that this spot was hit 2 or 3 times in succession. Captain Lieutenant Junak has stated that one shell penetrated the port turbine room at about 0930. Another entered the boiler room, section 13, between 0915 and 0930, starting a fire, possibly of fuel oil. Steam pipes burst, scalding ratings. Scenes below deck were indescribable. A direct hit in the after dressing station killed the medical staff and the wounded there. Hatches and doors in all parts of the ship had become jammed owing to distortion, resultant upon the terrific pounding the ship was receiving, and also because heavy wreckage now lay across most of the hatches opening on the upper deck. Crews in 2 magazines became trapped as they were unable to free exit hatches. As rescue parties worked desperately to save trapped men, fires above were raising the temperature within the magazines to a dangerously high level. Finally, the probability of explosion became so acute that rescue work was abandoned. Orders were given to flood, and the imprisoned men were drowned. In the forward canteen, 200 men also became trapped under jammed hatches. At the very moment when a hatch to the upper deck became freed, a direct hit crashed through the deck, transforming the canteen into a charnel house. According to one prisoner, not one man of this group of 200 strong survived, and in making his own escape, he was forced to pick his way between mountains of flesh and bone. This prisoner also described how he passed through the WT room where the entire staff had been blown to pieces. As Bismarck slipped beneath the Atlantic, roughly 800 men managed to escape into the sea. Most did not. An hour later, Dorsetshire pulled 86 survivors from the water, and the destroyer Maori rescued 25 more. The sea was 13 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill quickly. Fearing U-boats, the British broke off the search. Rescue came sporadically afterward. That evening, U-74 found 3 men alive. The next day, the German weather ship Sachsenwald recovered 2 more. Spain's heavy cruiser Canarias, sailing from Ferrol to help, found only the dead, 2 bodies lifted from the swell and later committed to the deep with naval honors. When the sea finally gave up its last accounts, the toll was stark. Of more than 2,200 aboard, only 115 survived. It may be of interest to note that one prisoner from the Bismarck crew mentioned the fact that members of the propaganda company had filmed the battle, remarking that if these films had ever been shown in Germany, there would have been no more volunteers for the German Navy. Burkhard von Müllenheim-Rechberg last saw Lindemann at about 0800 on the command bridge shortly before the final engagement. He later recalled that the usually sharp-minded, humorous, and upbeat Lindemann appeared withdrawn and pessimistic. Von Müllenheim-Rechberg attempted to speak with him, but received no response, and afterward questioned whether this was the result of battle fatigue or whether the ongoing disagreements with Lütjens had finally taken their toll. Lindemann's body was never found, and it is believed that he, Lütjens, and several other officers were likely killed in action when British shell fire struck Bismarck's bridge at 0902. When oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered Bismarck's wreck in 1989, he observed that much of the forward superstructure had been torn away by shell hits, with more than 50 shell impacts concentrated around the conning tower area. This evidence may lend weight to the theory. After Bismarck was sunk, the danger did not immediately end. German aircraft were dispatched to hunt Admiral John Tovey's fuel-starved fleet as it withdrew. On May 28th, bombers struck the destroyers Tartar and Mashona. Mashona was hit on her port side, the bomb exploded in a boiler room, and the damage proved fatal. Tartar rescued about 170 survivors, including Mashona's captain William Selby, but 46 men were lost. The remainder of the British fleet reached port without further incident. Meanwhile, Prince Eugen refueled at sea from the tanker Spischern on the 26th of May. The following day, engine trouble forced her to abandon her lone raider mission. Ordered by German command to break off, the cruiser turned for Brest, her Atlantic foray ending not in battle, but in mechanical failure. In another world, maybe the Bismarck would have met her there. At 1100 hours, only 20 minutes after the sinking, Winston Churchill informed the House of Commons gathered at Church House about the operations against Bismarck. This morning, shortly after daybreak, the Bismarck, virtually immobilized without help, was attacked by British battleships that pursued her. I don't know the result of this action. It seems, however, that Bismarck was not sunk by gunfire and now will be sunk by torpedoes. It is believed that this is happening right now. Great as is our loss in the Hood, the Bismarck must be regarded as the most powerful enemy battleship, as she is the newest enemy battleship, and the striking of her from the German Navy is a very definite simplification of the task of maintaining effective mastery of the Northern Sea and maintenance of the Northern blockade. Mr. Churchill had just sat down when he was given a note. The Prime Minister rose again and said, "I have just received news that the Bismarck is sunk." The cheers were loud and long. The official German announcement of the loss of the Bismarck was given later in the evening. Berlin, May 27th, 1941. The Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht announces the battleship Bismarck, which in her first battle against superior British forces sank the Hood and damaged the King George V, had her speed reduced by a hit forward. A torpedo from an aircraft attack that took place on the 24th of May again affected her speed. On May 26th, when 400 miles west of Brest, towards 21 hours, the ship was again hit by 2 aerial torpedoes from aircraft, destroying 1 steering gear and propellers, and the ship was unable to steer. During the night, the Chief of Fleet, Admiral Lütjens, sent the following report to the High Command of the Kriegsmarine. "Ship unable to maneuver. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Chief of Fleet." Contending with enemy naval forces which were gradually being reinforced, the battleship Bismarck went on fighting in her incapacitated state, until finally, on the morning of May 27th, she fell victim of the superior strength of 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, several cruisers, and destroyers. The British formation itself has been attacked early today by German bombers. The thoughts of the entire German people are full of pride and sorrow towards the victorious fleet commander, Admiral Lütjens, during his naval battle in Iceland, towards the battleship Bismarck, her commander, Captain Lindemann, and his brave crew. On June 6, 1941, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder briefed Adolf Hitler at the Berghof on the fate of Bismarck. Hitler pressed hard, why had Admiral Günther Lütjens not turned back after sinking HMS Hood, or destroyed Prince of Wales outright, even at the cost of Bismarck herself? Raeder answered plainly, Lütjens had acted under orders, avoid decisive battles unless they blocked the mission. A prolonged duel risked crippling damage and would have ended any chance of attacking merchant shipping, the operation's true purpose. In hindsight, Lütjens has often been judged harshly, but decisions made in fog, fatigue, and uncertainty are easy to dissect only after the fact. Both sides made critical mistakes, German and British alike, and any single error avoided might have changed the outcome entirely. For the Kriegsmarine, the loss of Bismarck was the heaviest single blow of the war. Though German naval power persisted into 1942, her sinking marked a turning point. Heavy surface raiders were effectively abandoned and the fight shifted decisively to submarines. The U-boat campaign would see great successes until its own turning point in May 1943. Bismarck's end also underscored a deeper change. The aircraft carrier had proven decisive, eclipsing the battleship as the dominant weapon at sea, a lesson reinforced at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. Today, the battleship era is long past, yet the story of Bismarck, her brief career, her ferocious resistance, and the men who fought her endures. A legend forged in steel, fire, and the unforgiving Atlantic.